What if one tiny strip of land, smaller than most cities, was quietly deciding whether millions of people go to war? What if the fate of an entire nation's economy came down to a 5-mile stretch of coral rock, sitting alone in the Persian Gulf? Before we go any further, hit that like button right now, because this story only gets crazier from here, and you don't want to miss a single piece of it. Subscribe if you're new, and send this to someone who still thinks this war is only about missiles and borders, because it isn't. Let's talk about Kharg Island. Most people had never heard this name before last year. Today, it might be the single most important piece of ground on the planet, not because of what's built on it, but because of what flows through it. Picture a narrow island off the coast of Iran, barely visible on a map unless you zoom in close. No skyscrapers, no population center worth mentioning, just docks, pipelines, storage tanks, and loading terminals. And through that unremarkable stretch of coastline moves almost 90% of every barrel of crude oil that Iran sells to the outside world. 90%, not a majority, not most, nearly all of it. That number is the whole story. Every rifle in the hands of Iran's military, every missile in its arsenal, every dollar that keeps the regime's security forces paid and loyal. Almost all of it traces back to tankers loading up at this one island. So when the United States keeps returning to this exact location, strike after strike, month after month, it's not random. It's not symbolic. It's the most direct way to slow down a war machine without sending a single soldier onto Iranian soil. You don't need to defeat an army of hundreds of thousands of people to bring a government to its knees. You just need to find the one artery keeping it alive and press down on it again and again until something gives. This didn't start last week. It's been building for months, and understanding how we got here changes how you see everything that's happening now. Rewind to late February of this year. Tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States exploded into open conflict. What started as strikes and counterstrikes quickly spiraled into something much larger. And within weeks, military planners in Washington had identified Kharg Island as the pressure point that mattered most. In mid-March, American aircraft carried out a massive raid on the island. Over 90 separate military sites were hit in a single operation. Air defense systems, radar stations, storage bunkers protecting the facility. But here's the detail that tells you everything about the strategy being used. The oil terminals themselves were left standing. Think about that for a second. The United States had more than enough firepower to turn Kharg's export facilities into rubble in a single night. They chose not to. President Trump said as much publicly, stating that American forces had wiped out military targets on the island while deliberately sparing the oil infrastructure. Why would you hold back like that in the middle of a war? Because oil doesn't stay in one place. It's a global commodity. The second you knock out 90% of a nation's exports overnight, you're not just hurting that nation. You're sending shockwaves through gas prices everywhere, from grocery stores in the Midwest to fuel pumps across Europe and Asia. A move meant to punish one country ends up punishing the whole world at the same time. So the plan from day one wasn't total destruction. It was control, hit the defenses, hit the military presence protecting the island, but leave the terminals and pipelines standing, because those become the leverage. That's the threat hanging over Iran's head that never quite drops, like a blade held just above the surface, close enough to feel, never close enough to fall. Then, in early April, it happened again. New reports surfaced, this time confirmed by a senior American official speaking to a major outlet, describing a second wave of strikes hitting military targets scattered across the island. Same pattern. Defenses hit, oil infrastructure spared. This is what escalation with intention actually looks like. Not one massive strike meant to end everything in a single night, but a slow, deliberate tightening. Turn the pressure up just enough that Iran feels it, without pushing the regime into a corner where it has nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose. Because a government that feels it has nothing left to lose becomes genuinely dangerous. But a government that still has something valuable on the table, something it desperately wants to keep, is a government you can still pressure, still negotiate with, still push toward the table instead of toward all-out war. Now here's where things start to get murky, and where a lot of confusion crept into public understanding of what was actually happening. At one point, U.S. Central Command publicly denied that a strike on Kharg Island had even taken place, directly contradicting earlier reports and statements that had come from other parts of the American government. Was that a deliberate move to protect operational secrecy while assessments were still underway? Maybe. Was it simply the fog of war, with different military branches receiving slightly different pictures of the same set of targets? Also possible. Nobody outside a small circle of decision makers can say with total confidence which strikes were officially confirmed and which were later walked back. The information coming out of an active war zone shifts by the hour, and a huge portion of what circulates online is edited, mislabeled, or completely fabricated. But here's what the pattern tells us. Kharg Island keeps getting hit, whether it's confirmed in the moment or not, and every single time Iran's state media insists the damage is minor or non-existent. Meanwhile, independent satellite companies keep releasing before and after images that tell a very different story. This is the same government that told its own citizens the Strait of Hormuz had been completely sealed off to international shipping, while thousands of commercial vessels sailed straight through that exact stretch of water during the same window of time. So when officials in Tehran claim Kharg Island suffered little to no damage, that claim deserves the same trust you'd give someone selling you a car with a suspicious grinding noise, insisting it's just a feature. Let's dig into why this administration has become so fixated on this one island, because the ambition here goes far beyond simply damaging Iran's economy in a general sense. Back in June, President Trump issued a direct and public threat, warning that the United States was prepared to strike Iran extremely hard, and that part of that plan involved seizing Iran's energy base on Kharg Island. Seizing, not destroying. That word choice matters. It signals something entirely different from a bombing campaign. Multiple news outlets reported that the administration had at least explored the idea of a ground operation to physically take control of the island. Would that actually happen? Occupying foreign territory in the middle of an active war zone is a completely different level of commitment than launching an airstrike. You're talking about holding ground, defending a perimeter, and supplying troops sitting just 20 miles off the coast of a country that still has drone swarms, fast attack boats, and coastal missile systems scattered along its shoreline. That is not a decision made lightly. But the fact that it was even floated publicly, the fact that the president brought it up on the sidelines of a NATO summit, tells you something important. In the minds of at least some planners, Kharg Island stopped being just a bombing target. It became a strategic prize. Whoever controls the location processing 90% of a nation's oil exports effectively holds the valve on that entire nation's economy in their own hands. And Iran clearly understands this. There have been reports of the regime reinforcing the island, moving in additional military personnel and air defense systems in anticipation of exactly this kind of scenario. Iran's parliament speaker made public comments about enemies preparing to occupy one of the country's islands, without directly naming which one. But everyone listening understood exactly what he meant. When your own officials avoid saying a target's name out loud because naming it makes the threat feel too real, that tells you everything about how seriously the danger is being taken. Let's take a moment to picture what's actually sitting on Kharg Island, because it isn't just a name on a map, it's decades of serious infrastructure investment. There's a major state oil company operating there, capable of moving roughly 500,000 barrels of crude a day. There's a petrochemical operation on the island as well. Underneath the surrounding waters, pipeline networks connect the island back to Iran's largest onshore oil fields. None of this was thrown together quickly. Kharg was engineered specifically because its deep water access allows massive supertankers to dock and load without needing to navigate the shallower waters closer to the mainland. It exists for one purpose: moving as much oil as physically possible, as fast as possible, out into the rest of the world. All right, quick pause here because we're deep into the details now, and I want to make sure you're still with me. If this breakdown is helping the whole situation finally click into place, do me a favor and tap that subscribe button before we keep going, because the next section explains exactly where this is heading, and you don't want to lose the thread halfway through. Something else worth knowing. This isn't the first time in modern history that Kharg Island has faced a sustained bombing campaign. Back in the 1980s, during the brutal war between Iran and Iraq, Saddam Hussein's forces repeatedly targeted this exact island. Iraqi military planners understood then what American planners understand now. You weaken a nation built on oil revenue by hitting its export terminal, not by grinding slowly through its entire standing army one unit at a time. Geography rarely changes, even when the political alliances surrounding it shift completely. And Kharg Island keeps ending up back in the crosshairs because of exactly that. Now let's connect this to the bigger picture happening across the wider region, because Kharg Island doesn't exist separately from the fight over the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow waterway is one of the most critical oil choke points on Earth, and Iran has repeatedly claimed it effectively closed the strait to international shipping. Each time, that claim gets disproven within about a day. American forces have been documenting this in real time, redirecting, disabling, and boarding vessels that attempt to break the blockade, while simultaneously allowing humanitarian shipments to pass through safely. At one stretch, U.S. forces had processed roughly 1,000 vessels moving through the strait over several months. That's a fraction of pre-conflict traffic, but it's still clear proof the waterway remains open, and that Iran doesn't control an international shipping lane simply because it insists otherwise. There was even an incident involving an unmanned oil tanker flagged out of a Caribbean port that was struck and disabled while attempting to reach Kharg Island in violation of the blockade after ignoring repeated warnings. That's not an accident, that's enforcement. And it's a pretty clear message to anyone trying to quietly keep Kharg's exports flowing under the radar. Here's the part of this entire situation that makes it genuinely dangerous, and I want you to really sit with this for a second. Every time the pressure builds around Kharg Island while the oil terminals themselves stay untouched, it sends a message that feels less like a warning and more like a countdown clock ticking somewhere in the background. Trump has said publicly that Iran's oil infrastructure would become the next target if the country keeps escalating and refuses to open the strait on its own terms. That's really the entire strategy in a single sentence. It's not primarily about permanently cutting off Iran's oil revenue right now. It's about using the threat of that outcome as the single biggest bargaining chip on the table. You dim someone's lights a little bit at a time until they come looking for a deal before you cut the whole grid. So why did Kharg specifically become the choke point instead of one of Iran's other coastal export terminals? Iran does have smaller facilities scattered along its coastline, but none come close to matching Kharg's capacity. Supertankers capable of hauling 2 million barrels in a single trip need serious water depth to dock safely, and Kharg was built specifically with those massive vessels in mind decades ago. You simply cannot redirect that volume to a shallower port down the coast and expect anything close to the same output. The physics of moving that much oil doesn't allow for an easy workaround. Cut the head off this one artery, and the rest of the system genuinely struggles to compensate, no matter how many backup terminals a country tries to lean on. It's also worth putting Kharg Island into a broader global context. The Strait of Hormuz is the obvious comparison, a shipping lane that a huge share of the entire world's oil supply passes through on any given day. But Kharg represents something slightly different. It isn't a waterway shared by dozens of nations. It's a single point of failure that belongs entirely to one country's economy. In some ways, that actually makes it a more attractive target from a purely strategic standpoint because degrading it doesn't require the same level of international coordination that comes with threatening to shut down a waterway the whole world depends on. It's surgical in a way a strait closure never could be. Iran's public response to all of this has followed a fairly predictable pattern. Officials accuse the United States and its allies of escalating a war that Iran itself keeps reigniting through proxy attacks and threats against international shipping, followed by vague warnings of retaliation against anyone perceived as assisting American operations. There's also been a steady stream of misinformation flooding social media throughout this conflict. Fake footage claiming to show massive retaliatory strikes that turn out to be recycled old clips, or in some cases, content that isn't real footage at all. Claims about captured personnel that never get backed up with real evidence. If you're following this situation online, apply a healthy amount of skepticism to anything that looks a little too dramatic or too perfectly timed. The information war happening around this conflict is arguably just as intense as the physical one. Now let's zoom out and talk about where things actually stand right now, because this story has taken a significant turn in just the past few days. For most of this year, the pattern was strikes, denials, more strikes, and a slow tightening of pressure. But recently, something shifted. Reports emerged that the United States had prepared what officials described as one of the largest planned attacks in recent memory, only for the president to call it off at the last moment, saying the outline of a deal had been reached. Talks between American and Iranian negotiators are now expected to resume, with Oman playing a role in mediating discussions specifically around reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Regional leaders have been pushing hard for this outcome. Saudi Arabia's leadership has publicly urged the American side to prioritize dialogue over continued military action. Whether this pause holds, or whether it's simply another temporary lull before the next round of strikes, is genuinely uncertain right now. Iran's foreign ministry has pushed back on claims that active negotiations are underway, which shows just how fragile and unresolved this moment still is. This is exactly why the Kharg Island story refuses to sit still. Just when it looks like the pressure campaign is reaching its natural conclusion, the entire situation shifts again. Let's talk for a moment about what a full-scale strike on the oil infrastructure itself would actually mean if that threshold is ever crossed. You'd be talking about knocking out a facility handling hundreds of thousands of barrels a day at minimum. Global oil markets do not respond well to uncertainty, especially uncertainty coming out of a region that already accounts for a massive share of the world's proven reserves and shipping routes. Prices at gas stations everywhere would move, and they'd move fast. That's precisely the kind of economic and political fallout that makes any administration think carefully before pulling that particular trigger, even against a hostile government on the other end of it. It's also worth understanding just how sophisticated Iran's workaround systems have become over the years, because none of this developed overnight. Decades of sanctions forced the country to get creative, building what's often described as a shadow fleet, a network of vessels that transfer oil ship to ship out in open water, switch flags, spoof their tracking signals, and hide ownership behind layers of shell companies. From a purely technical standpoint, it's an impressive logistics operation. But all of that sophistication depends entirely on having somewhere physical to load the oil in the first place. You can disguise a tanker's identity as much as you want, but you still need somewhere real to fill it up. And that keeps bringing everything back to the same island, no matter how many layers get added to disguise the transaction afterward. Here's why the deliberate restraint around the oil terminals matters so much strategically. Destroy the terminals completely, and you've used your best bargaining chip in a single move. You've also potentially created a genuinely desperate regime with nothing left to lose, still sitting on a stockpile of missiles. Keep threatening it instead. Keep circling it. Keep hitting the military infrastructure, protecting it while leaving the actual prize just out of reach. That maintains maximum pressure without forcing the absolute worst-case outcome. It's a razor-thin line to walk. And however you feel about the broader conflict, there's something genuinely calculated about how carefully that line has been managed so far. But leverage only works as long as the other side actually believes you're willing to pull the trigger eventually. If Iran concludes the United States will never go all the way and destroy the oil terminals because of the global economic damage that would follow, the threat starts losing its teeth. That's part of why these periodic strikes on the surrounding military infrastructure matter so much. Each one works as a reminder, a proof of capability, a signal that says the next step remains firmly on the table. Iran's neighbors across the Gulf have been watching all of this extremely closely too. Countries with their own oil infrastructure sitting nearby have remained on high alert throughout this entire stretch, worried Iran might lash out at regional targets if pressure on Kharg keeps building. There have been warnings issued by Iranian military command, specifically naming ports and facilities linked to American operations as potential retaliation targets, which puts every nation hosting American assets on edge. Debris from intercepted projectiles has already struck buildings in Dubai, thankfully without serious injury. A reminder that when a conflict centers on a single choke point like this, the shockwaves rarely stay contained to just the two main combatants. Before we wrap this up, here's one more quick ask. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about actually understanding what's happening in the world instead of just skimming a headline and moving on, and that puts you in a pretty small group of people right now. Drop a comment telling me whether you think the ceasefire talks hold or whether we're heading toward another round of strikes soon. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know what you think happens next. At the end of the day, this isn't just abstract strategy playing out on a whiteboard somewhere far away. Real pilots have to fly through Iran's remaining, degraded but not eliminated air defense network every time a raid happens. Real sailors patrolling that blockade line have to make split-second calls about which vessels are legitimate and which ones are trying to slip Iranian crude out the back door. This is a grinding, methodical kind of conflict, not the kind of single dramatic strike that makes for one explosive headline, but the sustained kind of pressure that actually shapes wars over time. And that might be the most important thing to understand if you're trying to guess where this goes next. This was never building toward one single knockout blow. It's a slow, patient squeeze, a campaign designed to make the cost of continuing this war climb higher for Iran with every passing week, all while trying to avoid crossing the line into the kind of global economic disruption nobody actually wants. So where does this leave us? Honestly, nobody outside a small circle of decision makers knows for certain. Does the current pause hold and lead to a genuine deal that reopens the strait and ends the strikes on Kharg Island for good? Does it collapse within days, sending both sides right back into open conflict? Or does this become a long, slow burn, stretching on for months, with Kharg Island remaining the backdrop the entire time? All three outcomes remain firmly on the table right now, and which one actually happens probably depends less on any single military decision and more on how much economic and political pain each side is willing to absorb before something finally has to give. Kharg Island is proof that modern warfare doesn't always look like tanks crossing a border or armies clashing in open fields. Sometimes it looks like a single, unremarkable strip of coastline, quietly deciding the fate of millions of people, one barrel of oil at a time. And whatever happens next, whether it's a lasting deal or another wave of strikes, this island isn't fading from the headlines anytime soon. If this breakdown finally made sense of everything you've been seeing in the news, share it with someone who's been just as confused as you were an hour ago, and I'll see you in the next one.